Okay, so we are recording. And I don't know that we need anything else except to introduce Faith. So we are thrilled that you're here with us, Faith. And I'm going to read from the formal biography because Faith put it together beautifully. Originally from New York, Faith graduated from Wellesley College with a degree in sociology. While attending Marquette Law School, she gave birth to all three of her sons sequentially, year by year. After graduating from law school, she practiced as an attorney for 5 years. Her casework was primarily in the area of family law and included domestic violence advocacy and guardian ad litem work, representing vulnerable individuals. She became interested in investigations and was encouraged by a number of colleagues to look into a career in federal law enforcement. Never one to pass on a dare, Faith took the test for the U.S. Postal Inspection Service after a law enforcement client challenged her to do so. And a year and a half later, she got a call asking her to report to the training academy in 2 weeks. And she found herself on a flight to Washington, D.C., where she worked as an inspector for 14 years. Her art career began as she worked in law enforcement, giving a voice to 7 chronically homeless men over a period of 6 years in the documentary 30 Seconds Away, Breaking the Cycle, which premiered at the Milwaukee Film Festival in 2015. Her work as an attorney and in law enforcement offered Faith a unique lens through which she tells stories of both human suffering and hope. And Faith, take it away.
Well, hi, everyone. Good evening. And I want to say thank you for having me come and speak tonight. I have a presentation I'm going to go through, and the gist of tonight is really to talk a little bit about the role of art and artists in activism. So I'm going to walk you through some of the background and history related to the art that I do, and I want to make sure that I leave room for questions at the end. So I think if you have questions, you can put them in
use the chat box.
Chat, yeah, and Beth will manage that. And in the meantime, I'm going to try not to embarrass myself as I share my screen and tee up the presentation. Can everybody see that?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, beautiful. So the theme for tonight, Broken Windows and Beyond, is about art activism and social reform. As Beth said, I mean, I came to art through law enforcement, and I feel like sometimes my career sounds a little bit scattered when you look at the different things that I've done, but I have to say art is really the place where everything I've ever done in my career, including advocacy and giving voice to people who are marginalized, has started to really make sense and gel. I built an installation earlier this summer that's actually installed right now at a facility called No Studios in Milwaukee. It's an art and filmmaking hub run by John Ridley, the Hollywood director, who is originally from Milwaukee and created this space where social activism and art and film all kind of collide. And I installed this exhibit, which is about broken windows policing. You know, when I look at what's been going on in this country this year, the thing that sticks out in my mind is how divisive and divided as a society we've become. And it really spoke to me earlier this summer when I was watching the protests going on about George Floyd's death. And I woke up one morning thinking, broken windows, broken windows, broken windows. And I want to explain the theory of broken windows policing, which is something that I not only learned, but I also taught when I was in law enforcement as part of a community policing effort to try and reduce crimes in our communities. In the early 1980s, broken windows was a theory developed by social scientists George Kelly and James Wilson. And their theory was that if communities address even small signs of disorder like broken windows, that somehow it would empower neighborhoods to do a better job, strengthen their communities, and somehow deter more serious crimes. And what ended up happening was this theory, it sounded great, but there really was never any evidence showing that it worked. And what happened in the 80s was that a lot of police departments looked to this theory as sort of a foundation for police policy. And in the 80s, where a lot of modern day policing policy was developed around broken windows policing, the theory was really misapplied. And what ended up happening was basically, and I looked to New York City as a classic example, under Rudy Giuliani, it became, let's look at graffiti, let's look at, people who are smoking marijuana in public, loose cigarette sales, panhandling, and really in a lot of marginalized and a lot of low income and minority urban communities, what ended up happening was people were getting over policed for really minor stuff. And instead of actually deterring larger crime, what broken windows policing served to do was create a wedge between police and the community they were there to serve. People began to mistrust and fear the police instead. And so you ended up essentially with what we look at now and say, well, we have two systems of policing. When we go to the suburbs and we see police cars driving by and people think, hey, they're the police to serve and protect us. You get a very different response as police in many inner city communities. And I credit that unfortunate response to a lot of the broken windows policing that began in the 80s. Broken windows evolved over time. And if we look at Mike Bloomberg's stop and frisk policies in New York City, that's a classic example of how the fear and mistrust began to blossom and seed and grow and kind of start to span generations at that point of people who were afraid of the police because they couldn't walk down the sidewalk without potentially getting accosted and asked to show ID and being searched. We call them Terry stops. And it led to a lot of profiling and frankly, a lot of abuse of discretion and increase in complaints about police misconduct. But really, if you think about it, it went into place because Bloomberg put it there. So it was essentially sanctioned systemically. Even though this theory was unsupported, it staggers me sometimes how many generations this has gone on. So another thing that I see when I think about broken windows policing and how this schism has happened, the place we are now in our society where you have entire movements devoted to defunding and dismantling the police, is we have started over time more militarizing police. And I guess for it to explain to civilians, sometimes it's hard. My police training, we were taught how to do building entries. And when Columbine happened, and we had to revamp the way we did tactical building entries, every police department, every officer in any law enforcement agency in this country was retrained. So I put that out there because I want to come back to that later and say, so we know it can be done, that when you have a method of doing something in policing that is glaringly insufficient to meet current needs, we saw with Columbine and with the retraining for tactical entries, that it can be done. But what's essentially happened is as we've militarized policing, what I translate that to is, if you think about police knocking on your door, let's say, your car was broken into and your neighbor calls the police, and the police would drive up and they would knock on your door. Well, if you're a suspect in, let's say, a drug crime, and I go to the Breonna Taylor case as an example, no knock warrants. Who knocks at your door or not, how they enter your home, what uniforms they do or don't wear, what equipment they carry, what they drive, all go towards the militarization of policing. And there's been an increase in that in response, I think, to more and more violent crime in our communities, rather than essentially going after the root of what's causing the crimes. What the police have done is put more resources into building like a paramilitary structure where you see police now in tactical gear and helmets and riot shields. And it's very different from the way policing, I think, was intended and the way it used to look. And what ends up happening now is community policing might mean something different wherever you go. Typically we think of community policing as people know the police in their neighborhood. They're not afraid to call the police when they see crime in their neighborhood. And a lot of community policing efforts are really aimed at engaging with neighborhoods, engaging with citizens, and building programs that are targeting prevention of crimes by engaging the community. And it's very inconsistent when you compare that with the militarized law and order approach that we've seen in some of our cities. When you show up to something and your police are in riot gear, they're not approachable. That's not necessarily presenting a face of a police organization that communities would feel comfortable reaching out to or interfacing with. And so I go back to like the root of broken windows policing and the flaw in the theory is that we've been seeing these failures for years. And they've really, to me, what started my path on this exhibit is that I saw them really coming to a boiling point this year in ways that I think none of us could have imagined. Some of the notable cases that we're all familiar with, Michael Brown and Ferguson. I point out just a couple of things about each of these cases that jump off the page at me when I look at the fact that Michael Brown was unarmed. He was actually fleeing the police. What was he suspected of? Stealing a pack of cigarillos and pushing a store clerk. Okay, so I don't want to go overboard and say it was a non-violent crime. It was. He put his hands on someone, but how that scenario happened left a man dead over a pack of cigarillos. Eric Garner, loose cigarettes. I go back to Rudy Giuliani's focus where he said, police, I want you to actually go forth and stop people for selling loose cigarettes and for graffiti. In 2014, Eric Garner died during a police interaction that started because he was selling loose cigarettes. Philando Castile case in Minnesota. This was horrific. He was stopped for a broken taillight. He actually told the officer that he had a gun in the car, and the officer shot him before anything could really happen. George Floyd, obviously, I think was probably the most egregious example of what's wrong with the way our communities are policed right now. When I point out that the reason the police were there, and it was 6 officers on the scene, it was a suspected counterfeit $20 bill that he died for. And obviously Breonna Taylor, I took issue with the AG in Kentucky saying she was in the wrong place at the wrong time. She was in her bed, in her home, asleep, when a warrant was being served. So that's the type of policing that I see is there's a systemic effort to say, well, this is how we police. And yes, it's unfortunate when people die, but this was one bad incident, one bad apple. And I really feel like a lot of the protests that we've seen in some of our cities are activism at its finest, where people are saying, no, maybe this shouldn't be how we police. I put together a quick graphic just to show you, because I'm a very visual person, being an artist and a filmmaker, the difference between the perception of community policing and militarized policing. And I guess I would just ask you to think about, as you look at these images, how do they shape the way you think about police? How comfortable does anyone feel with that second image of militarized policing if that is who came through your doorway, looking for maybe someone at the wrong house even, right? This is what our policing has become in a lot of our communities in the US. And when I look at the difference, right? Community policing is supposed to be about partnerships, problem solving. It's supposed to have transparency. It's supposed to have accountability for police, where they are interfacing directly with the community to explain what they do, how they do it, why they do it, and be there to help, protect, and serve, versus the militarized policing that many of our inner city residents across this country see, which is military equipment, assault weapons, flashbangs going into houses. And I've carried those weapons, I've worn that gear. I can tell you those aren't comfortable scenarios for anybody, the cops or the citizens whose houses are getting raided by people wearing that. So now I'm going to switch gears here to protest. And I did a little research on protest. Why do we protest? What's the point of protesting? Are we publicly expressing opinions about things we don't like? Are we raising awareness? Do we want to influence public policy or legislation? You know, one of the really interesting things about the protests we're seeing this year and in some recent years is that protests become sort of a larger movement that joins a lot of smaller movements. When you see like the Women's March and you see Black Lives Matter and you see all of these different groups in different communities who are advocates for very specific, sometimes very narrow causes, all come together into one larger, powerful movement to protest. It is, I think, it says a lot about how many people and how many different aspects of our communities, from the suburbs, from the cities, professionals, you know, people who, you know, work hourly jobs versus, you know, salaried executives, all out there together as one voice is pretty powerful. And I think the fundamental way that I view protests at this stage of 2020 is it seems to have become most significantly a demand for change. I just did a panel this weekend about the role of art and artists in activism. And I look at what we do as trying to change narratives, trying to capture scenarios of our current culture, showing snapshots of what's going on around us, and helping raise awareness where there is injustice. And I see art potentially as a very powerful vehicle for change. And it, in a lot of ways, for me, it comes as a very non-confrontational vehicle to talk about what we need to change in our society. The image you see next to it is a piece from my Salvaged exhibit. The exhibit itself is a collection of salvaged windows that I've painted, all to look as if they are broken or cracked. And I've been conducting interviews with people from all different areas of all different communities. I've talked to activists in Miami, in New York, in Milwaukee. I've talked to psychiatrists. I've talked to attorneys. I've talked to medical doctors and nurses, people who work in emergency rooms and mental health facilities. And I've talked to people who are poor, who are marginalized, who are on unemployment, who are on, you know, state welfare benefits, who are receiving, you know, food share benefits, who are, you know, parents of children in public schools. I've talked to children who went through the public school system. And what I've done is taken all of these interviews and created a series of questions that I've then placed in different positions on these windows to start talking about what else is broken and why our broken social issues keep interfacing with police. And I think the role of the artist in shaping and challenging cultural narratives is significant at a time like this, because there's so much out there to protest. There's so much that we see that's the matter. And I've been very privileged to work with a group of artists from all over the world in this last exhibit this weekend, the Social Justice Summit I was participating in. And I gotta tell you, no matter what cause any of us are addressing with our art, I will say art really has something for everybody. It has something that will reach everybody. I went back through history a little bit to look at art as protest. And I pulled a couple of notable pieces to kind of underscore the point. The piece on the left is the death of Michael Stewart, the Faceman. It's a Basquiat piece. I love Basquiat. I love street art. Michael Stewart was an artist who in the early 80s was chased down while waiting for a train to go home. He was chased down by a New York City transit cop who suspected him of spraying graffiti in a subway station, kind of a la Giuliani. And Michael Stewart ended up getting beaten so badly by this whole group of New York City transit cops that he died 3 days later. And Basquiat's piece was intended to protest the death of Michael Stewart and kind of to point out back then in the early 80s, that which we are seeing now kind of on steroids, which is a petty offense like graffiti, someone suspected of it, ends up getting beaten to death by an entire group of police officers. And so that was Basquiat's way of saying, I do not accept this. I memorialize this moment. I protest it, and I want people to remember it. And the piece on the right, Banksy is another one of my favorite artists, Flying Copper. I would point out in this piece the contradiction that you see, the smiley face, and then the automatic weapon that the police officer is holding. And to me, that illustrates perfectly my point about what's wrong with modern day policing, that it is so contradictory to try to have the police be community minded and officer friendly mode while we have police walking around on our streets and entering people's homes with automatic weapons. There's another piece, a film that I don't have up here on the slide, but it was in the Milwaukee Film Festival the same year my first documentary came out. And it was an interesting film. It's called Peace Officer. And I would encourage each and every one of you to take a look at it if you're interested in the issue of militarization and how it applies to modern day policing. Again, it's called Peace Officer. And I had a chance to meet the filmmaker. It was an interesting story in that a guy was a sheriff, I think in like Utah, and developed a tactical team, SWAT response. Like when I say tactical entries, it's like SWAT team is how we know that. And he developed a tactical squad response, trained the team while he was the sheriff. And some years later, his daughter was actually being held at gunpoint, like a hostage situation in a domestic violence by his son-in-law. And his son-in-law ended up getting shot and killed by his own tactical squad using the techniques that he taught them. And the entire film explores how we have militarized law enforcement and how when you're dealing with civilians in a democracy, how militarization really is a painful place to be. And he kind of traces the evolution of it and talks about the disparities and impact that the militarization has had on people in poor and underserved communities. So this is a very interesting piece. When I reflect back on the changes historically in the way we police. And so this slide, this is a little bit about Salvaged, my protest, and what I do. And so again, I find these windows and I essentially paint them. And how this exhibit has evolved over this summer has been working in quarantine in my studio here in Milwaukee, but also conducting interviews. I set a different number of interviews every week and started reaching out to people to ask who knows somebody who's a psychiatrist who's willing to give me 30 minutes and talk about what's broken that has led to calls for police service. And that's really, I mean, for me, that's really the gist of it, is when I look at what policing is expected to do in our communities, I think that's part of the problem too. And that's part of what my exhibit is intended to protest as well. When you're a law enforcement officer and you put on a uniform and you go out and you do what you are trained to do, you may be responding to someone who's in the midst of a mental health crisis. So when that happens, my question now looking at this country is, how many officers do we have really on every department or any department who are trained to manage an untreated mental health crisis in a way that's going to diffuse violence, that's going to de-escalate the situation? And I say, when I look back at history, I think there have been too many calls for police service for mental health crises that have ended in violence. They have not had good outcomes. Domestic violence is another scenario that police are first responders, right? They're able to respond to a call for service, may or may not have a lot of information when they arrive, but they're stepping into a situation, a social issue that was so broken before they got there, that I ask, what's the role and scope of police? And that's the entire premise of my exhibit, is questioning the role and scope of law enforcement in today's society. When I look at law enforcement in the context of so many of our larger societal needs, we need police reform. It's my opinion. I'll say it loud and proud. We do. But we need social reform to happen alongside and in conjunction with police reform, because to me, reforming police in a vacuum still doesn't solve the underlying social issues that are the root cause of so many calls for police service. And I'm speaking as an artist, but I'm speaking as someone who worked in law enforcement. I'm speaking as an attorney, who worked with people in crisis. And I think when that 911 call takes place and police show up on the scene, expecting them to be able to manage every crisis, every scenario that has gone wholly unaddressed in many ways by so many different elements and broken systems in our communities, is like expecting that when you call an ambulance, the EMT who shows up to transport you is actually going to be able to perform brain surgery on that aneurysm. And so I look at it as multi-system failure, and the police are one system. And so that's why I've spent the time on this exhibit, and that's why I'm actually so happy to be able to share it with the public now, because I want all of us to understand the role we all can play in activism, right? I'm an artist, I'm a loudmouth, Beth can attest. When something doesn't seem right, I speak up. And I found that for me, filmmaking and art have not only been a great outlet for me, a great vehicle to help raise awareness, no matter what community I'm in, right? I go to different communities, I screen my film, I do artist talk, I do filmmaker talks, and I talk about the need for us to help shape tomorrow's policymakers, help educate tomorrow's policymakers. And for me, I found art is a great vehicle. Now, when I said before, art has something for everybody, I really think it does. And to me, anyone who's interested in art can find ways to use art as a great non-confrontational conversation starter about issues. I do it all the time when I go in places and I say, yeah, I used to be a law enforcement officer. Some people, their hackles will go right up and they will back away slowly. But when I come in and say, this art is about this topic, this piece is about that issue, people can talk about art and eventually segue into the issues. And so I feel like in a group, like especially NCJW, like I'm a member in the Miami chapter, and I love all the activism that I see. Beth keeps us informed about all the stuff you guys have been doing in the Chicago area, and I see it happening all over the country. And that's where I say, like, smaller groups making up one larger group that can join with other groups and actually create this huge wave of activism and huge movements, because they're all working towards social equity, racial justice, whatever the cause. I feel like, for me, art has a huge place in that, not just as a means of documenting what's going on in our current society, but also as a means of getting different groups to engage and open up. And I feel like anyone who likes art, who has the capacity to look at a piece of art and say, I like it, I don't like it, this is what I like about it, this is what I don't. I would encourage everyone to take a look at the different protest art that's out there over time. You know, I historically go back, look at Basquiat, look at Goya, look at any artist who interests you and find how they engaged about current topics, and maybe use that as a means where each of us individually or together as groups can help raise awareness and start conversations with other groups in our communities to find those commonalities. So these are some of the questions that I asked. This is my last slide, and then I'm going to stop talking and start taking some questions here. But I looked at, with this exhibit, it was interesting, some of the perspectives that I got. I was talking to police officers who said, well, why doesn't anybody ask what it's like to be us and walk into communities where nobody wants you there? You know, to get out of our, you know, we could be sitting in our squads in a city and people will shoot at us because we wear uniforms. People spit on us and disrespect us, and yet we're expected to be like this or like that. So I turned those into some questions. I talked to a young man who said, do you know how it feels when I walk out of my house and I step out on my porch, and at least twice a week, some cop is out there telling me to put my hands up against the wall and he's searching my pockets. Like, I can't even go out on my porch without someone acting like I did something wrong. And I haven't done anything wrong, but it's the color of my skin, the neighborhood I live in, and I can't help any of that. So who's gonna change this? You know, I talked to teachers who said, wow, I have a lot of students who have single parents, and I wish I could find a better way to support them because their kids are home alone in the afternoons because they have to work. And maybe they're, you know, essential workers, but I'd like to try to find a way to give them better homework support, but I'd like to see our schools do it so that we teachers aren't always doing this out of our pockets. You know, so questions about literally everything from mental health to nutrition factored into when I looked at the totality of calls for police services. And really the question behind my questions is, what causes crime? Because if we are not, as a community, as a society, looking at what causes crime holistically and asking our systems how we can better help address the things that cause crime, as I said, it really, to me, puts police reform in the context of much wider social reform in terms of all of our social programs that are in silos and failing people in our marginalized communities. So that is my art, that is my truth, that is my activism. And I'm done talking. Let's take some questions.
Oh, thank you, Faith. You've given us a wonderful perspective on putting everything all together. So, and I think one of the things that struck me the most is how police have become so much more militarized. And as a citizen, it sort of came on gradually. And then I said, oh yeah, that's what's happened. And as we see the reaction to protests this summer, that's a very sad commentary. So I'm going to look, we have lots of comments that really question some of the same things that you're giving us questions about. Violent protests can't stop violent police behavior. So society has to work long and hard to affect the needed change.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's what you've been saying.
Yes.
Kathy Carmody said that this is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. Do you work with domestic violence groups?
I have.
Okay.
I have. I honestly, I feel like no social issue should ever get left unaddressed. And I represented enough people who couldn't find decent advocacy, especially when I practiced law here in the Milwaukee community. We had a lot of underserved survivors of family violence in the Spanish-speaking community. And so I got an education on my feet working with clients who needed decent representation. My Spanish, yeah, I get by with it, but who really just needed someone to have a heart for the work they do. So organizations that have a heart for people who are struggling, I always have a heart for working with those organizations.
Bev Copeland said, are you aware of the firearm restraining order? That was a bill that was passed in Illinois in 2019 and allows removal of a firearm from an unstable gun owner who is at risk to himself or others. So you might not have heard of that living in Milwaukee and Miami, but that was an important step here in Illinois.
It is, and there are similar laws in other states. I would say guns are I got a whole wall in my studio devoted to gun violence and the need for some order to be made out of the chaos that is how we deal with or don't deal with guns nationwide, because I love that there's progress being made in legislation. I do. I think we need more of it. The concern that I have in part is we don't always know when someone has a gun. It's very easy to skirt gun laws in a lot of states with private sales. And because we don't really have any centralized way of knowing, I was joking around with somebody this weekend during this panel, and I said, I have to register my car with the government and pay to have a car and tell them I have it, and it has to pass emissions testing. But a 12-year-old who had you could have had hunter safety training at age 12 in the state of Wisconsin, and that's all the training you need to qualify for gun ownership, get a concealed carry license, and you don't actually have to tell anybody you have your guns. So those are areas where I feel like having laws on the books is probably the biggest step. That's the hardest step, is making that legislation happen. But when you get legislation that's good like that, that's solid, that has footing, my opinion is we then need to build supporting legislation around that legislation that doesn't leave loopholes.
Yeah, and that's been one of the biggest problems with this bill too.
Yeah.
Bev Copeland says, defunding the police seems to drive people crazy. What do you think would be a better terminology? Because I know I asked Jewish Council on Urban Affairs, a group that we've worked with, said they're supporting defunding the police. And I said, well, I'm not so sure that's the right thing. Oh, that's not what we really meant. And I'm thinking, huh? So Bev is saying, what would be better terminology?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not a big fan of defund the police either, because it isn't what it sounds like. And I'm a person, like, I say what I mean. I say what I think. And I think we need to reallocate resources. We need to reframe the police, in my opinion. It's not just about the money, because whether or not police departments have money isn't the issue. At least my humble opinion, what are they spending the money on? Because when I see departments investing in more militarized equipment, better automatic weapons, armored vehicles, riot shields, more tactical training, hey, yeah, I see that stuff. And what I haven't seen are many departments spending money on de-escalation training. A lot of cops that are out on the streets in some cities, all they've ever had is a few months at a police academy at a community college, and that's the training they get. And particularly if they are going to be asked to interface with people who are victims of crimes, who may be dealing with trauma, whether it's ingrained trauma that they were born into and raised with, or experiencing trauma right now because of a circumstance that's led to police showing up. I think it would behoove the departments to spend money on training officers how to substantively deal with that. And so to me, it's not so much about funding as it is who is policing, how they police, how they're trained to police, and what their budgets are going for. Because I think the totality of it isn't really working so well for a lot of our communities and a lot of our citizens. So to me, it would be about reframing. I'd like the word reframing the police into something different, maybe salvaging the elements of it that we absolutely need as first responders, but then figuring out what we actually want and need police to do in our communities.
Yeah. And we've had some suggestions. Neil Samuel said, transform public safety. Harold Winston said, refunding the police. So yeah, those are other things. I like your rephrasing as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, because when you hear defunding, you think take it away. And so I think, yeah, you address that. Thank you. What concrete actions can we take to help bring about change and positive results? Because we're very involved in wherever we can in advocacy and change legislation. Is there anything else that we can do? Specific.
Okay.
I mean, many of us are involved in gun violence prevention, so that's one of the effective ones. Yeah.
Well, for me, a lot of this starts with if you have the ability to raise awareness and grow your group, grow your cause. Look at the cards you all sent out, right? That was an amazing outreach effort. And I think one of the best things about groups like NCJW is the ability to sort of unflinchingly do outreach. So to me, the more people you can reach, the more pressure you can apply. When you have enough like-minded souls coming together, the more pressure you can apply to ask pointed questions of our lawmakers to see what they are doing. I mean, I think for me, a lot of why I look at gun violence, I mean, it's an issue in and of itself. It's an interesting issue. It's a complex issue, but I look at it in terms of the impact that gun violence has in Chicago in particular, who has its fair share of gun violence. And we've done studies across the country in cities. They appoint committees, commissions, Office of Violence Prevention, like at a very localized level. Sometimes they get tunnel vision and they're looking at sort of a microcosm. I would say with the power of an organization like NCJW, benchmark across the country and look at your different chapters in different areas and see what's working. Where you have less gun violence, look at what's happening in those states, in those cities, and see if you can apply some, well-aimed pressure in whatever form that activism looks like that works for your group. I mean, you all know the power that a group with a voice has to change things for groups that don't have much of a platform or a voice. And I think your reach gives you the ability to amplify the message substantially.
Thank you. Are you familiar with any police departments that are making successful reforms?
Yeah, there are some, and it's baby steps, I think, wherever it takes. There's one in particular, and I don't know why, but Camden, New Jersey just popped into my head. I would have to look and I'll send it to you. Where they—
That's what Adam Lisberg said.
Yeah, and so that's one that comes to mind in terms of community policing. There are programs around the country. When I look at the issue of violence in and of itself, there are programs around the country that have been having a modicum of success. And it actually gives me a lot of hope as a civilian now. These interrupter programs, where specially trained groups of civilians are essentially first responders to do interventional work to see if they can diffuse and deter a situation before it erupts into violence. Now, that said, it is very specialized, because I've heard people say, like, oh, why don't we send unarmed responders to domestic violence calls? To me, anytime there's a word violence involved, I think there should be some element of appropriate response. We talk about the force continuum in law enforcement. If you're actively showing aggression towards me, I go one level up from you. So if you're coming at me with a closed fist, I might be justified in taking out a non-lethal weapon, like a baton. If you are chasing me with a knife, I might be justified in using a firearm against you. So when I look at programs that are aimed at deterrence, that are aimed at prevention, it's essentially the ones that are having success are where they reach the community before there's a crime in progress. And so these violence interrupter programs, I think Milwaukee might have had one a while back that I was reading about, but there are some cities that have been using violence interrupter trainings and programs that have, as I said, I have seen some modicum of success. And that's where I say, like, success is also relative, right? I think you could look at Milwaukee, the homeless outreach team that they started here in 2010. And I very lucky, I got to document it from the backseat of their squad car with my film crew, because we followed them as they opened their doors, because we wanted to see what their outcomes looked like. And so when I say I look at impact and I look at outcome, ask them, they would tell you they've had a very successful homeless outreach program. I go back to square one and ask the question, why are the police responding to homelessness and engaging with homeless people as a means of crime prevention? Because I've seen the other side of that coin, which is sometimes the police make everything worse. I look at the Dontre Hamilton shooting in Milwaukee, that turned violent very rapidly when a homeless outreach officer approached. And I get to the point where I say, like, we have to look at what success means with programs. If our goal is to have police in some communities do community policing, I would say look to communities that have successful homeless outreach programs, that have successful violence deterrence programs, even like dealing with family violence. Sojourner Truth, the Sojourner Family Peace Center here used to be just a traditionally called like a domestic violence shelter. Now it's a family peace center where they not only have combined resources where they share space with the Milwaukee Police Department sensitive crimes detectives, they operate out of Sojourner, but they have the ability to do restraining order courts, have people appear from the safety of the Peace Center remotely for restraining order hearings, so they don't have to be in the same room or worry about going to the courthouse. They're also, they do training programs for offenders who want to work through their offense and learn how to not commit violence in the future. Because a lot of times, a lot of it is, with trauma-informed care, you see that it's learned behavior. And so I would say, like, if, depending on the issues you want to solve in your own communities, benchmark with the types of programs that match your community's needs. Because what one department defines as success might be a very different definition of success than what another city would call that, in essence.
Ev Copeland pointed out that we have a number of those violence interrupter groups in Chicago, and Eddie Bocanegra was our speaker in spring, I think it was May, and he was featured in Alex Kotlowitz's book and has gone on to be an interrupter and in a big program where he works individually with people and has been successful. Jill Lexier says, from your own experience as a federal agent, can you share your most satisfying experiences and your most bleak?
Sure. How much time you got? No, I'm just kidding. So I think the most rewarding experience I had, I would say two of them. One was I have never been one to shy away from a challenge or a dare. And I saw a lot of letter carriers in the inner city zip codes in Milwaukee and Racine as well, afraid to come to work, because it wasn't just that it was violence directed against them, although there was quite a bit, but they were becoming collateral damage in open air crimes happening on the streets, two drug dealers fighting and shoot between houses at each other, and a letter carrier is walking up the street and is caught in the crossfire. So I was challenged to find ways to make employees of the Postal Service feel safer at work, be safer at work, when their workplace was inherently unsafe and completely out of their control. And I ended up piloting a few things, trying, like, I'm one of these people, I'll try something. If it doesn't work, I click on something different. But I ended up creating a program that became a nationally recognized and used model in other high crime inner city zip codes, that was aimed at everything from employee engagement and education to community engagement and awareness raising about the impact of crimes in neighborhoods on the delivery of the US mail. And so it took about a year and a half to build that, but it was really rewarding. Even now, I am still in touch with some of the people that worked out on the streets back when I was an agent, who said it changed the way they thought about their own safety. And they became much more engaged with their own accountability, but they also became much more engaged with others, about creating a safer world. So that was one thing. And then the other thing was I caught an armed robber, in a cold case about 2 years after the crime happened. He pistol whipped an older woman employee very badly. The weapon discharged and a number of people were injured in this armed robbery. And the case was ice cold when they handed it to me, like a week out of the academy. And it took me 2 years. But I was able to look her in the eye and tell her that we caught the guys who did it and got justice for her. And that was, I would say that was probably the most rewarding thing, was being able to look at someone who was so traumatized by this crime and tell her it was okay to sleep safe at night, that we caught him. So,
Wow.
and the most awful ones, I don't think those are fit for polite discussion. I would say one of the worst was, I was chasing a guy and ended up getting jumped and beaten, and his mother, who was, I think, almost 80, also jumped me and bit me. I have a scar right here on my wrist from it. But it was probably one of the first days in my career. It wasn't the only day, but it was one of the first days in my career where I actually wondered if I was going to be able to go home and see my kids that night, or if that was curtains. So,
Yeah, that's pretty scary.
yeah.
Mary Weinberg says, do you think there should be federal funding of the arts under a Biden administration?
I always think there should be federal funding for the arts under any administration.
How to tie it together with law enforcement and some of the things you're doing, I think that's behind the question.
Yeah. So because I'm an out of the box thinker, and I think, Beth, you can probably attest to that better than anyone. I actually have been thinking about ways to do it. There was an artist a number of years ago who was interested in environmental issues in New York City and created an artist's residency for herself with the New York Department of Sanitation that became like a lasting residency. And I'm all about like public-private partnerships. And I do think that art has a place anywhere we want it to. I'm not even biased as an artist when I say that. But I actually have been thinking about ways to try to create an artist's residency for myself, because art, like, to me, artists are all about what opportunities are we going to have next. And I've been trying to think of how to do this for next year, to create an artist residency with a police department in a way that could help use art to bridge the gap between police and communities. Because like I said, art is the best conversation starter. It's so non-confrontational sometimes to talk about art rather than police or citizens or why people hate each other. And I actually have been talking to a friend of mine who runs an arts nonprofit, because this is not what I'm great at, is trying to figure out how to put this stuff together. I'm learning on my feet because I'm still emerging in my artist career. But I think that having police departments and artists interface could only produce something unique and good. I don't see a downside in that. I think artists have the ability to bring a different lens and help amplify perspectives and voices. So whatever the roles would look like, I feel like art could actually help a lot of our public agencies do a little better with the public and have an open and exchange of perspectives through art.
Sounds like, yes, like almost common sense. Judy Green asks, to what extent is the type of personality drawn to policing as a career contributing to our issues with policing? Would attracting other personality types make a difference, and is that possible?
You know what? Thank you for making that point. That is huge. And I say that because our police departments are full of people who come from a lot of them, I guess I don't want to overgeneralize, but a lot of people who are drawn to police are people who are former military, or who believe in this kind of law and order perspective. And I think the end result of that is that recruiting people with specific personality types has widened the divide between communities and police, because when people come into police and they want to do it, they're drawn to it because they want to have that badge, they want the power, they want the authority. Frankly, those make the worst police officers on the planet, because they're not in it to serve and protect. If they come in it and they see people as less than, I mean, John Ridley said, the true meaning of social justice is the ability to see ourselves in other people. And I live that. I lived that as a law enforcement officer too, but I worked with a lot of the big personalities, the big egos, that they thought that badge gave them the authority to treat people however they wanted. And I believe that if we were to widen the net that we're casting, looking for people to serve and protect our communities, we would find a lot of different people who are much more suited to policing the way a lot of our communities would probably speak up and say they would rather be policed. Do we need people who can respond and address crimes? Absolutely. But do you know that in all the years I served the community in law enforcement, it was a rare occasion when I had to draw my weapon, actually thinking that I might need to use it, because one of the first things I learned, and I had great mentorship from someone actually on the Milwaukee Police Department who took me under his wing, was how to talk to people. And so I agree 100% that if we were to look at how to recruit different types of personalities, we probably would see less police violence occurring, because we would have people that come from diverse array of lived experiences that they would bring to policing. And I really think it would make for a better society in terms of how we interact with police. So I really appreciate you raising that. And, I couldn't agree more that that might be one of the biggest roots of what needs to change in policing, is who's policing is very often seems to be the problem.
Kathy Carmody said there's a story about it, an NPR story about an artist residency in Philadelphia's Attorney General's office. So something
Yes.
to check on. Thank you, Kathy.
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, and very things I think you'll follow up. Merle Gross asks, how broad is your definition of art? Does it include writing, or is it just canvas, paper, physical images?
Oh no, art is the spoken word, the written word, music, performance art, visual art, digital art, canvas, paper, all of the above. I think art is very, very much what we make it. It's funny, I never really identified myself as an artist when I called myself a filmmaker all those years. And when I kind of branched out and started doing visual art a couple of years ago, one of my friends, who is quite a talented fine artist from Iran, said, "No, Faith, you are an artist. Look at your film. Of course you're an artist. Why would you say you're not?" And it really reshaped my own perspective about art, to put myself in a category as an artist, as a filmmaker. So let me tell you something, working and immersing myself with artists the last 2 years, I would say if you think it's art, it's art.
Okay, good definition. Okay, we have two related questions from Mary Weinberg. I think for this to happen, talking about changing a police force, police have to develop a sensitive side, be sympathetic to LGBTQ people. And then Kathy said, Carmody asked, do you believe in diversity and equity training can work. So I think those are related.
So to the first portion of that, yes. I think the more diversity we see in police departments, the more compassion we will see towards people in communities that are diverse. I think you can't say, well, we are policing in primarily Black communities, or we're policing in primarily Hasidic Jewish communities, so we'll stick a couple of people who look like the people they're policing on and we'll say we're diverse, right? No, to me, that's tokenism. It's who they are and how they are rather than what they look like, because not every diversity classifier is something we can openly see on people. And so to me, the compassion in the way we police, it's not there in all officers. It's there in some. I would say every department has great, compassionate officers. And the other side of that spectrum is every department has racist, bigoted, homophobic, authoritarian officers. And so, yeah, I think the more the pendulum swings to the compassionate side. Now, the question is, can you teach people compassion? Can you teach people? You can teach people how to work with victims and survivors of trauma. You can teach people skill sets. You can teach them what to do.
Carrie, come on down.
You can't necessarily change who they are. So I guess I asked the question of, do I think we need more equity and racial justice and types of training for police officers? Absolutely. A lot of departments now are rolling out, implicit bias training to their officers to teach us about the biases that we don't even know we have. But because I step back and look at the bigger picture in the context of wider social needs and the need to really reshape what police do, my question is, do we think an implicit bias training will work on people who are inherently racist? And do we think that individuals being trained will have that significant of an impact on a system that may in and of itself be inherently racist, the way it functions? So questions and answer to the questions, but I do think those are questions that we as a society have to address, because if we just look at giving individuals, I used the analogy the other day, one officer doing something wrong, and right away police departments step out and say, well, he's a bad apple. Well, when more than that happens, when this becomes, there are more incidents, or this isn't just an isolated thing, well, is it the barrel that has a problem? And I think if we were to step back and say perhaps the orchard is diseased, what do we do with that? And to me, the answer is you can cut down the trees for firewood, get rid of the apples that are diseased, and reseed and try to build an orchard that's healthier than the one that you just had to take apart. But I really feel like continuing to address one bad apple or throw away one barrel isn't going to fix the orchard. So when I hear about, when I get questions about, training on bias and racism, I would just say, if your belief, which mine is that the system is inherently set up to function exactly the way it does function, and it's racist kind of on its face the way it is, what do we do about that? Do we bandage what we can, or do we find the source of the hemorrhage? And that's going to look different, I think, in every community.
Thanks. Where'd it go? Jill Lexier said, have you experienced any anti-Semitism?
Yes.
Okay. So lots of opportunity there for all sorts of training as well in the body.
Yeah, There are more Jewish police now than there were years ago. But I still think there's a fundamental disconnect in some of our communities. And frankly, a lot of the people that I worked with a lot of really nice people. So if I had duty and it was Rosh Hashanah, or, we had a violent crime that happened on Yom Kippur, or, whatever. And I'm not going to pretend I'm super observant. I'm not, but I always tried to respect the holidays. And so I would ask my team if someone could cover, and it was no different than, me taking their, robbery or assault calls on Christmas, if something happened. And so I felt like it was something people didn't really necessarily understand, but I had the misfortune of working with a small town, northern Wisconsin police department, where I swear the police chief could have been like the head of the KKK or something, with some of the things that came out of his mouth. And it was so, and what was even funnier at the time, I mean, funny, not funny, was that my agent in charge, my boss, was a Black man. And the two of us drove clear across the state of Wisconsin, to deal with something. We get this guy who is just a complete, backwards person in terms of his thinking. And I think after 10 minutes of being completely insulted, offended, and just, repulsed by everything that came out of his mouth, we went about our business and got out of there as quickly as we could. Both of us afraid for what would happen if that traffic stop happened on our way out of town in our unmarked squad, because we got the feeling that was just the lay of the land up there. And it was a very uncomfortable feeling in modern day society to actually have to tuck in the chai that I wear around my neck, or make sure I didn't have any symbols showing, and here's my boss going, well, what am I supposed to do? It's not like I could paint my face white on the way out of Dodge here. So I think law enforcement has some evolution to do, even in responding to crimes that involve anti-Semitism. A lot of times they don't even understand that the symbols are anti-Semitic or why they're offensive. And that's where I start to find it systemically problematic for citizens, because when that stuff happens, it should get the same response as any other hate crime, no matter where it happens.
One comment and one other question, and then we'll be able to give you the whole chat box. Merle Gross says there just isn't much in the way of psychological tests. So, we're still we're a long way from all sorts of things, including how do we sort them out? Bob Schwartz asks, can you identify the most important original source issues that create acts of police violence, such as mental health, drug use, unemployment, child abuse? Is there?
I would say one of the main common denominators is poverty.
Okay.
The more poor a neighborhood, the less opportunities people have. I would say poverty is the root cause of so many of the social problems that evolve into violence, because being poor doesn't just mean in this society anymore that you don't have money. If you're poor and you live, let's say in the inner city somewhere, and your school probably doesn't have enough resources to go around, so the quality of education isn't as good, which means eventually the opportunities that are available to you aren't as good. I think someone was saying last week on TV, we're sick and tired of being sick and tired. And I think that stems from, I think that sense of inequity that comes hand in hand with the, disparity in treatment that people of color see in our underserved communities. So I credit a lot of crime as being rooted in poverty, because it kind of leaches into everything else. When you're poor, you don't have access. You don't have access to transportation. You don't have access to jobs, education. You don't have access to, health resources, mental health resources. And I think from an early age, the people that I have met and spoken with and interacted with who are raised in poverty describe a very denigrating experience, a very dehumanizing and denigrating experience from go. When you're waiting in line to get free breakfast, free lunch, you're waiting in line, somewhere to get some type of benefits, and the way people are treated. I'm not saying poverty directly causes violence, but I think the end result, the impact of poverty has a lot of outcomes that are violent, in essence, because when you're poor, there doesn't seem to be a consistent way to support people out of poverty. And what ends up happening is everything sort of festers, and look what you end up with, the types of trauma that people are growing up with in our cities and the types of violence. So
Merle Gross says she thinks Bob was asking about roots of police violence, and what you're saying is so true about
well, and that goes back to it though. Police inherently, who polices is a root cause of police violence against citizens, right? Can police adequately police in neighborhoods they don't understand? If you weren't, I'm not saying every police officer has to be raised in a poor, violent community to understand what it's like for victims of crime in a poor, violent community, or how to make a poor, violent community safer. But there's a disconnect between police and communities that I think is at the heart of much of the police violence that we've seen. That disconnect comes from who we hire as police officers. And it goes back to psychological testing. I had a sales job when I was 21. I worked for a pharmaceutical company for a minute. And I had to go through all this psychological testing to get hired for a sales job. I had to go through almost none of that to get hired into law enforcement. I mean, it's like now that I think about it, it kind of seems weird, doesn't it? I think a lack of training is perhaps at the heart of a good portion of the police violence that we're seeing. But again, I am troubled by the fact that so much of the police violence that we see ends up getting sanctioned. When we have a justified shoot, maybe justified legally, but a lot of it sometimes doesn't seem very morally justified to us as we're watching as civilians. And I think because police officers lack accountability, because we as citizens don't always understand their due process and what that looks like, but they're entitled to due process. And I say, where was George Floyd's due process when the cop who responded about a counterfeit $20 bill became judge, jury, and executioner all in one, right? So I think the fact that police are set up and buffered with process, and they're protected by the system, the same system that's failing our citizens, that the system's supposed to be protecting and serving. I see that as a root cause too, is that it's not just about accountability, it's the laws, it's the regulations, it's the due process rights that officers are entitled to. It's who they hire as police, how they train them is kind of the next level of it. But I think when we look historically, a lot of the cases of police violence, there might be a common thread that maybe some of these people just shouldn't have been hired in the first place. They didn't have the right personalities for it. You can blame it on they're doing what they were trained to do, but I believe that argument didn't really work when the Nazis tried that either. It becomes a question of moral accountability. And so to me, I think the problem is in police violence is essentially the police are being hired and brought in to respond to things that they are inherently escalating in many ways. And it's the who, it's the how. But I think until that element of flawed policing gets fixed, we'll probably see more violence. I hate to say it.
But our final question is from Kathy Carmody. Where do you see your art heading these days?
Anywhere it takes me.
Okay.
I enjoy using my art to raise awareness, to go out into communities and share it, whatever that looks like. And it's interesting because this pandemic has really changed the way we as artists interact with people. I'm used to going to an auditorium, going to a medical school or a nursing school or a community group, and showing clips from my film, or speaking at conferences where the room has a bunch of people in it. And here, all of a sudden I'll Zoom. I'm like, well, I better start taking better pictures if I want people to actually see what this looks like. But I think as long as there is human interest in human issues, I think you'll probably see me somewhere in that direction. I love using my art and sharing and learning from communities, and then going back and teaching other communities through it. And it's all a journey. I don't know where my journey has always taken me. I just am happy following the path to see where it goes.
Yeah, that's terrific. I want to thank you from everyone for giving us a human and personal approach to everything. Certainly when I think that you majored in sociology, this is putting everything all together. Between the art and understanding people, and working with cops and being able to share with everyone. So we're supporting you in every way we can.
Thank you.
When I send a summary, I'm going to put all the resources together so people can look at your salvaged exhibit even more, including the lyrics. We were talking about the lyrics from South Pacific. You've got to be carefully taught. I'm going to include those too, because we were talking about that for another exhibit. So thank you so much.
Well, I want to thank you guys for having me. I hope you take something away from this, and I'm grateful for all the activism and advocacy that NCJW is doing.
And
so
that,
I want to thank you for letting me be part of that.
I want to. I'm looking at all the chat, all the thank yous. So we'll go on with that. I have a couple of announcements to make. Rhea Slider said that November is the NCJW Gives Back initiative, that we're going to be, NCJW is collecting non-perishable food items for food pantries. And this month their donations are going to go to the ARC, the Niles Township Food Pantry, and the Nuestro Center. And there's a link that I'll send on the NCJW site for people to drop them off. They're at people's houses, so we didn't want to publicize it, lots of different places. And also our next city salon is going to be Strangers to Sisters. The Sisterhood of Shalom is bringing Muslim and Jewish communities together, one person at a time. So it's going to be a real interesting discussion. So I think our awareness is raised, and this continues with all the other programs that we've had. So we will go forth and share. So thank you so much. Good luck in your exhibits and your upcoming work.
Thank you.
And can keep it up.
Thanks a lot, guys. Take care.
Thank you, Faith. It was fantastic. Thank you, Beth.
Thank you.
Take care, all of you. Be safe.
Bye-bye.
You too. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Terrific, another terrific program.
Yeah, we're just thrilled. Yeah.
Beth,
Yes.
can you send me a copy of this presentation? You've got a.
Yeah, it's being recorded.
Yeah.
So I will send that.
We should make these recordings available.
Oh, they are. Yeah, they are.
On the NCJW website?
They're on YouTube, and I will find out from Melissa how
to inquire.
Yeah, it'll take a day or so for Melissa to get this up onto
Fabulous.
YouTube too, but they're all available somewhere up in the ether there.
Okay, well, I don't know why we can't have a link to them on their website.
I'll get them from, yeah, that's a good point. That's a real good point. Okay, we will do that. So thank you so much, everyone. This is terrific. We'll see you next month.